I'm going to be reading chapter 12. Shroud is a cloth that they put over the dead. Impiety is not being pious, not being religious about something. Infamous is being famous for something bad. Conical is of a cone shape. Galvanic is a violent reaction, as in chemistry. Chaplain is a preacher type person at like a prison or a hospital. Requiem is a song played at a person's death. The thing you need to know is that the Château d'If is on an island. 12. Now that the treasure, which had for so long been the object of Faria's meditations, could assure the future happiness of a young man he truly loved as a son, its value had doubled in his eyes. Every day he spoke of the immensity of the treasure, explaining to Dantès all the good a man could do for his friends in our modern times with such a fortune. At those moments, Dante's face would darken, for he remembered the oath of vengeance he had sworn, and he thought of how much harm a man could do to his enemies in our modern times with such a fortune. Faria did not know the Isle of Monte Cristo, but Dantes did. He had often passed by that small island, located 25 miles from Pianosa, between Corsica and the Isle of Elba, and once he had landed there. It was, and still is, completely deserted. It is a rock of almost conical form, which seems to have been thrust up from the bottom of the sea by some volcanic cataclysm. As Faria had predicted, his arm and leg remained paralyzed, and he lost almost all hope of ever reaching the treasure himself. But he continued to dream of an escape for his young companion. For fear the letter might be lost, he made Dantes learn it by heart, word for word. Then, one night, Dantes awoke suddenly with the impression that someone had called him. He opened his eyes and tried to penetrate the darkness. His name, or rather a plaintive voice trying to articulate his name, reached his ears. He leaped out of bed and listened. No doubt of it, the voice was coming from Faria's cell. "Good God!" murmured Dantes. "Could that be?" He shoved back his head, rushed into the underground passage, and was soon at the opposite end of it. The flagstone was raised. By the flickering light of the lamp we have already described, he saw the old man, his face deathly white and contracted by the horrible symptoms which Dantes already knew, and which had filled him with such terror the first time he saw them. "Well, my friend," said Faria resignedly, "you understand, don't you? There's no need for me to explain anything to you. Think only of yourself from now on, of making your captivity bearable and your escape possible. You'll no longer have a half-dead body tied to you, paralyzing all your movements. God is doing something good for you at last, and it's high time for me to die." Dantes could do nothing except clasp his hands and cry out, "Oh, my friend, my friend!" Then, regaining a little of his courage, he said, "I saved you once, and I'll save you again." He lifted the foot of the bed and took out the small bottle, which was still 1/3 full of the red liquid. "There's no hope," said Faria, shaking his head, "but you may try if you wish. I'm growing cold. I feel the blood rushing to my brain, and that horrible trembling is beginning to shake my whole body. In 5 minutes, the attack will begin in earnest. In a quarter of an hour, there will be nothing left of me but a corpse." "Oh," cried Dantes, his heart breaking. "Do as you did before, but only this time don't wait so long. After you've poured 12 drops down my throat, if you see that I'm not regaining consciousness, pour the rest. Now carry me to my bed. I can't stand up any longer." Dantes picked up the old man and laid him on his bed. "And now, my friend," said Faria, "sole consolation of my wretched life, you whom heaven gave me a little late, but gave me nonetheless, at this moment, when I'm about to be separated from you forever, I wish you all the happiness and all the prosperity that you deserve. My son, I bless you." Dantes dropped to his knees, leaning his head against the bed. A violent shock interrupted the old man. "Farewell! Farewell!" he murmured, pressing Dantes' hand convulsively. The attack was terrible. Twisted limbs, swollen eyelids, bloody foam, a motionless body. This was all that remained of the intelligent being who had been there only a moment before. When he believed it to be the right time, Dantes pried Faria's teeth apart with the knife and poured 12 drops of the liquid into his mouth. He waited for 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour, half an hour. There was no sign of a movement. Trembling, his forehead streaming with cold sweat, he decided the time had come to try his last resource. He poured the rest of the liquid into Faria's mouth. The medicine produced a galvanic effect. The old man shook violently in every limb. His eyes opened, frightening to behold, and he heaved a sigh which sounded like a shriek. Then his trembling body gradually became rigid again. Finally, the last murmur of his heart ceased. His face grew livid, and the light faded entirely from his eyes, which remained open. It was 6 o'clock in the morning. The first feeble rays of dawn invaded the cell, casting weird reflections over the face of the corpse and giving it an appearance of life from time to time. As long as the struggle between day and night lasted, Dantès was still able to doubt. But as soon as day went out, he realized fully that he was alone with a corpse. An overwhelming terror seized him. He no longer dared press that hand hanging over the edge of the bed, nor look at those vacant, staring eyes which he had vainly tried several times to close, but which had always opened again. He blew out the lamp, hid it carefully, and fled from the cell, replacing the stone behind him as well as he could. He left none too soon, for the jailer was coming. This time he began his visit with Dantès' cell. Nothing indicated that he was aware of what had happened. He went out. Burning with impatience to know what would happen in the cell of his unfortunate friend, Dantès crawled back into the underground passage in time to hear the jailer calling for aid. Other jailers soon arrived. Then came the heavy, measured footsteps of soldiers, and behind them, the governor. Dantès heard the bed creaking as they tried to rouse the dead man. The governor ordered them to throw water in his face. Then, seeing that this had no effect, he sent for the doctor. The governor left the cell, and several words of compassion, mingled with crude jokes and laughter, reached Dantès' ears. "Well," said one voice, "the old lunatic's gone off to find his treasure. Bon voyage." "With all his millions, he still didn't have enough to pay for his shroud," said another. "Oh, the shrouds of the Château d'If don't cost much. Since he's a priest, maybe we'll go with a little extra expense for him. That's right. He'll have the honor of the sack." Dantès listened without losing a word, but he did not understand much of what was being said. Soon the voices died away, and it seemed to him that everyone had left the cell. He was nevertheless afraid to go back in. A jailer might have been left behind to guard the dead man. After an hour or so, the silence was broken by a faint noise, which gradually grew louder. It was the governor coming back, followed by the doctor and several officials. There was a moment of silence. The doctor was evidently examining the body. He declared the prisoner dead and diagnosed the cause of death. "Not that I doubt your competence, doctor," said the governor, "but we can't be satisfied with a mere examination in such cases. I just ask you to carry out the formalities prescribed by the law." "Very well, then," said the doctor. "Heat up the irons." This order made Dantès shudder. He heard hurried footsteps and the sound of a door being opened. Several moments later, a jailer came back into the cell. Then the thick, nauseating odor of burning flesh penetrated the wall behind which Dantès was listening in horror. Beads of sweat burst out on his forehead, and for a moment he thought he was going to faint. "You see, he's really dead," said the doctor. "That burn on the heel is decisive. The poor madman is cured of his madness and delivered from his captivity." Dantès heard a sound like the rustling of cloth. Then the bed creaked. There were heavy footsteps like those of a man lifting a burden, and the bed creaked once again under the weight which had been placed back on it. "Will there be a mass?" asked one of the officials. "Impossible," replied the governor. "The chaplain asked me for a week's leave yesterday, and he's already gone. If the poor priest hadn't been in such a hurry, he'd have his requiem." "That's all right," remarked the doctor, with the impiety common of those to his profession. "God won't give the devil the pleasure of receiving a priest." There was a burst of laughter. Meanwhile, the body had been laid out. "Tonight," said the governor. "What time?" asked one of the jailers. "At around 10 or 11 o'clock as usual." "Shall we watch over the body?" "What for? Just lock the door as though he were still alive." The footsteps went away and the voices died down. Then a silence more mournful than that of solitude, the silence of death, invaded everything and chilled the depths of Dantès' heart. He slowly raised the stone with his head and cast a swift glance around the cell. It was empty. He entered. Stretched out on the bed, faintly illuminated by the pale ray of daylight coming in through the window, he saw a sack of coarse cloth under whose ample folds he could discern the outlines of a long, stiff form. It was Faria's shroud, that shroud which, according to the jailers, cost so little. It was all over. Dantès was separated forever from his old friend. Faria, his helpful, kind companion, now existed only in his memory. He sat down on the edge of the frightful bed, plunged in deep and bitter melancholy. Alone. He was alone again. The idea of suicide, which his friend's presence had driven away, now rose up like a phantom beside his corpse. "If only I could die," he said. "I'd go where he's gone, and I'd be with him, but how can I die?" He thought for a moment, and then said, smiling, "It's very easy. I'll stay here and attack the first man who comes in. I'll strangle him, and they'll guillotine me." But then he recoiled from the idea of such an infamous death and swiftly passed from despair to a burning thirst for life and freedom. Die? Oh, no, he cried out. What would be the point of having lived and suffered so much if I were going to die now? No, I want to live, to fight on to the end. I want to win back the happiness that was taken away from me. I must punish my enemies before I die, and I may also have some friends to reward. Forget me here. And the only way I'll ever leave this dungeon is like Faria. As he spoke these words, he sat stock still, staring into space like a man suddenly struck by a terrifying idea. Then he stood up, put his hand to his forehead as though he were dizzy, and murmured, "Who sent me this thought? Was it you, O God? Since only the dead leave here, I'll take the place of a corpse." Without giving himself to reconsider his desperate resolution, he leaned over the hideous sack, slid it open with the knife which Faria had made, took out the corpse, carried it to his own cell, put it on his own bed, wrapped around its head the rag which he himself always wore, pulled his blanket over it, kissed the cold forehead one last time, tried once again to close the rebellious eyes which persisted in remaining open, and turned the head to the wall so that when the jailer brought in his evening meal, he would think he was already asleep, as he often was. Then he went back into Faria's cell, took out the needle and thread, threw off his clothes so that the jailers would feel flesh under the sackcloth, slipped into the sack, placed himself in the same position as the corpse, and sewed up the sack again from the inside. If the jailers had happened to come in at that moment, they would have heard the beating of his heart. His plan was all worked out. If the grave diggers discovered that they were carrying a living man instead of a corpse, he would quickly rip open the sack with his knife and take advantage of their terror to escape. If they tried to stop him, he would use the knife on them. If they carried him all the way to the cemetery and laid him in a grave, he would let himself be covered over, and then, since it would be night, as soon as the grave diggers had turned their backs, he would force his way up through the soft earth and escape. He hoped the weight would not be too heavy for him to raise, otherwise he would be smothered to death. But even this possibility did not dismay him. At least everything would be finished. Towards 7 o'clock in the evening, his anxiety began in earnest. He trembled in every limb, and his heart felt as though it were being gripped in an icy vice. The hours passed without bringing the slightest movement in the prison. So far, his ruse had not been discovered. Finally, he heard footsteps on the stairs. The time had come. He summoned up all his courage, held his breath, and tried to repress the pounding of his heart. The door opened, and a dim light reached his eyes. Through the cloth covering, he saw 2 shadows approach the bed, a third one in the doorway holding the lantern. The first 2 men took hold of the sack from both ends. Dantès made his body rigid. "He's very heavy for such a skinny old man," said one. "They say every year adds half a pound to the weight of a man's bone," said the other. They carried him out on a stretcher, and the funeral procession, led by the man with the lantern, went up the stairs. Suddenly, Dantès felt the cold, fresh night air and the sharp wind from the sea. The sensation filled him with both joy and anxiety. They carried him some 20 yards further, then stopped and laid the stretcher on the ground. Dantès heard one of the men walking away. "Where am I?" he wondered. His first impulse was to try to escape, but fortunately he controlled himself. A few moments later, he heard one of the men walk up to him and drop a heavy object on the ground. At the same time, he felt a rope tied around his feet with a painful tightness. "Have you made the knot?" asked the man who had remained idle. "Yes, and it's well made. I'll answer for that." "All right, then let's go." The stretcher was raised, and the procession continued on its way. The sound of the waves breaking against the rocks on which the Château d'If is built reached Dantès more distinctly with every step. "What miserable weather!" said one of the men. "I wouldn't like to be at sea tonight." "Yes," said the other. "There's a good chance the priest may get his feet wet." They both burst out laughing. Dantès did not understand the joke, but his hair stood on end nevertheless. "Here we are," said the first man after a while. "No, further on, further on. You know the last one got smashed on the rocks, and the next day the governor called us a bunch of lazy rascals." They went on a few more steps, and Dantès felt them pick him up by the head and swing him back and forth. 1, 2, 3. With the last word, he felt himself flung into space. Fear clutched at his heart as he fell like a wounded bird, down, down, down. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, there was a tremendous splash, and he plunged like an arrow into the icy sea. He uttered a scream, which was immediately choked off as the water closed over his head. He was being swiftly dragged to the bottom by a cannonball tied to his feet. The sea is the cemetery of the Château d'If.